In the early summer of 1944, in the hedgerow country and open wheat fields of Normandy, a rumor moved through the ranks of the American and British armies faster than any order from headquarters. Tank crews called it the Ronson problem, after the cigarette lighter company whose slogan promised a flame on the first try every time. The M4 Sherman, the medium tank that made up the overwhelming bulk of Allied armor in Western Europe, had earned a grim reputation. German tank crews and infantry, watching Shermans burn after a single hit from an 88mm gun, gave it an even darker nickname, the Tommy Cooker. Whether spoken in English or German, the message was the same. When a Sherman met a German Tiger tank in open country, the outcome was rarely in doubt, and the men who climbed into Shermans knew it. This is the story of that tank, the problem that defined its reputation, and the way a small number of American and British crews turned a machine widely dismissed as inferior into the instrument that helped bring an empire down. To understand why the Sherman carried this reputation, it is necessary to understand the industrial and strategic thinking that produced it. In 1940 and 1941, the United States Army was rebuilding an armored force that had been starved of investment for 2 decades. The Ordnance Department, working with the armored force at Fort Knox, needed a tank that could be built in enormous numbers, shipped across 2 oceans, maintained in the field by relatively inexperienced mechanics, and operated by crews trained in a matter of months rather than years. The result, designated the medium tank M4 and standardized in 1941, was built around a 75mm gun adapted from a French design of the First World War era, a gasoline engine in most variants, and welded or cast armor with a maximum thickness of about 75mm on the hull front. It was not designed to fight other tanks head-on. American armored doctrine at the time held that dedicated, faster tank destroyer units, not medium tanks, would handle enemy armor, while the Sherman's job was to support infantry and exploit breakthroughs. This doctrine would prove badly mismatched to the battlefield reality Allied crews actually faced. The companies that built the Sherman reveal the scale of the effort behind it. The Detroit Arsenal tank plant, built and operated by Chrysler starting in 1941 on a design contract from the Ordnance Department, became the largest tank-producing facility in the world. Alongside Chrysler, manufacturers as varied as Press Steel Car Company, Pullman Standard, Baldwin Locomotive Works, Fisher Body, and Ford Motor Company all produced Sherman variants. Between 1942 and 1946, more than 49,000 Shermans rolled off American production lines, making it the second most produced tank of the war after the Soviet T-34. This production capacity was itself a form of strategy. American planners understood they could not match Germany tank for tank in armor thickness or gun power, so they chose to win through numbers, reliability, and logistics instead. The Sherman's mechanical layout reinforced this strategic choice at every level of its design. Most production models used a Continental R975 radial aircraft engine adapted for ground use, a powerplant already familiar to American industry and simple enough for a wartime trained mechanic to service in the field with standard tools. Later production shifted some variants to a Ford GAA V8 engine, and export models bound for Britain and the Soviet Union sometimes used a Chrysler multi-bank engine built from 5 automobile engines joined to a common crankshaft, an unusual but workable solution born of wartime engine shortages. The tank's suspension, a vertical volute spring system, was mechanically unsophisticated compared to the torsion bar suspensions used on the Panther and Tiger, but it was rugged, cheap to manufacture, and easy to repair with parts that could be shipped in bulk across the Atlantic. Every one of these choices reflected the same underlying philosophy: build a tank that could be manufactured quickly, shipped in enormous quantities, and kept running by ordinary soldiers rather than specialist engineers, even if that meant sacrificing raw fighting power against Germany's best vehicles. That strategic bet collided with a very different German answer to the same problem. In August 1942, the German army fielded its first Panzerkampfwagen VI, the Tiger I, a 56-ton heavy tank built by Henschel und Sohn in Kassel. Its 88mm KWK-36 gun, adapted from the famous Flak 18 aircraft gun, could destroy an Allied tank at ranges beyond a mile, while its front armor, up to 100mm thick, could shrug off hits from most Allied tank guns at almost any range they were likely to be fired from in Normandy's close terrain. Roughly 1,350 Tigers were built in total between 1942 and August 1944, a fraction of Sherman production, but the disparity in numbers mattered less than it should have because of how badly the 2 tanks' guns and armor were mismatched. An American or British tank gunner needed to maneuver dangerously close to a Tiger, ideally to its thinner side or rear armor, before his shot had any real chance of penetrating. A German Tiger gunner needed only to see the Sherman first. German armored doctrine, shaped by hard lessons from the Eastern Front against heavily armored Soviet tanks like the T-34 and KV-1, had moved decisively toward vehicles that traded mobility and production simplicity for raw protection and firepower. This was the opposite of the American approach, and it produced a tank that was, on paper, formidable in nearly every category that mattered in a direct engagement. The Tiger's overlapping and interleaved road wheels, while contributing to a smoother ride and better weight distribution, made the tank notoriously difficult to maintain, particularly in muddy or freezing conditions where packed debris between the wheels could immobilize the vehicle entirely. Its transmission and engine, while powerful, were prone to mechanical failure under sustained use, and Tiger units frequently lost more vehicles to breakdowns and lack of spare parts than to enemy fire. These weaknesses would matter enormously over the course of a long campaign, but they offered little comfort to an Allied tank crew facing a functioning Tiger across an open field in Normandy. The men who commanded and crewed these machines were not abstractions, but documented individuals whose choices shaped the battles that followed. On the German side, the most consequential figure to cross paths with the Sherman in 1944 was SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, a tank commander of the Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 101, the heavy tank battalion attached to the 1st SS Panzer Division. Wittmann had already built a formidable combat record on the Eastern Front, where German propaganda credited him with the destruction of well over 100 Soviet tanks. He was a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, personally decorated by Adolf Hitler, and by the time his unit arrived in Normandy in June 1944, he was already a celebrated figure in German military media. On the Allied side, the story turns on far less famous men. British tank crews of the 4th County of London Yeomanry and, later, the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, ordinary soldiers who had trained on Shermans in England and who would spend the summer of 1944 learning, unit by unit and loss by loss, how to survive against an enemy whose machines outclassed their own on paper. Trooper Joseph William Ekins, born on July 15, 1923, in the small Northamptonshire village of Yielden, was among these ordinary soldiers. Before the war he had worked at a shoe factory, a detail that underscores how thoroughly the Allied armies of 1944 were staffed not by career soldiers, but by civilians drawn from Britain's and America's ordinary industrial workforce, and given only months of training before being sent into combat against opponents like Wittmann, who by contrast had spent years honing his craft on the Eastern Front. Ekins served as the gunner in a Sherman Firefly commanded by Sergeant Gordon, part of No. 3 Troop, a squadron, 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, a unit that had landed in Normandy as part of the broader buildup of British armored strength following the initial invasion. The institutional knowledge behind the weapon Ekins would use that August afternoon came from a separate group of engineers entirely, chief among them Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge, who had personally experienced the limitations of Allied tank guns after being wounded and blown out of the turret of his own vehicle at the 1942 Battle of Gazala in North Africa, an experience that gave him a direct, personal stake in solving the very problem his Firefly conversion would later help correct. The clearest demonstration of that mismatch and the failure that defined the Sherman's reputation came on June 13, 1944, at the town of Villers-Bocage in Normandy. The British 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, had pushed forward in an attempt to outflank German defenses west of Caen. A column of the 4th County of London Yeomanry, equipped with Cromwell tanks and a handful of Sherman Firefly tanks armed with the more powerful 17-pounder gun, halted in the town for a pause in the advance. Unknown to the British, elements of Wittmann's heavy tank company had bivouacked nearby along the road to Caen. Wittmann, seeing the exposed and stationary column, attacked alone in his Tiger. In an engagement that lasted a matter of minutes, his single tank destroyed a Cromwell, a Sherman Firefly, 8 half-tracks, 4 troop carriers, and 3 Stuart light reconnaissance tanks before withdrawing into the town itself, where further fighting among the buildings destroyed several more of his Tigers to British infantry using PI-80 anti-tank weapons at close range. By the time the action at Villers-Bocage was over, the British had lost 20 Cromwells, 4 Sherman Fireflies, and 3 Stuarts, along with dozens of soft-skinned vehicles, and had suffered 13 killed, 5 wounded, and roughly 170 men reported missing, most of them taken prisoner. It remains one of the most one-sided small unit tank actions of the war, and it became, almost overnight, proof in the eyes of many soldiers and journalists that the Sherman and its British cousins simply could not fight the Tiger on anything like equal terms. News of the engagement spread quickly through Allied units still fighting their way inland from the Normandy beaches, and it hardened an impression that had already begun to form during the first week of the campaign. War correspondents embedded with British and American forces reported soldiers' accounts of Sherman's bursting into flame after a single hit, and the psychological effect on green troops preparing for their first armored engagements was significant. Some historians have since argued that Wittmann's feat at Villers-Bocage was amplified well beyond its actual tactical significance by German propaganda eager for a morale-boosting story after the loss of Cherbourg and the stalemate developing around Caen. But the documented losses that day were real, and the tactical lesson that a single well-handled Tiger in good defensive terrain could destroy an entire armored column was one Allied commanders could not afford to ignore. The weeks that followed exposed the same pattern again and again across the Normandy front. American armored divisions pushing south from the invasion beaches ran into German Panther and Tiger tanks dug into hedgerow country, where visibility was often less than 100 yards and where a single well-placed German tank could stall an entire column. Belton Cooper, a maintenance officer with the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, later documented in his own post-war writing how his division, which began the Normandy campaign with 232 Sherman tanks, saw 648 of them destroyed in combat over the following 11 months, with hundreds more knocked out and repaired, a cumulative loss rate so severe it meant the division effectively replaced its entire tank strength multiple times over. Tank crews who fought at places like the Roer Plain in Germany described firing more than a dozen rounds of their tank's main gun at a single Tiger before scoring a hit that mattered, only to be destroyed themselves by a second German tank moments later. In one documented action on that front, the U.S. 2nd Armored Division lost 38 medium tanks and 19 light tanks destroyed or knocked out in a single day's fighting, along with 56 men killed, 281 wounded, and 26 missing, a toll that only began to ease once crews called forward attached 90mm tank destroyers, nicknamed can openers for their ability to punch through German armor that the Sherman's own gun could not touch. The 75mm gun, standard on most early Shermans, adequate against infantry, bunkers, and older armor, simply lacked the velocity to punch through a Tiger's frontal plate at any range a crew was likely to survive reaching. Faced with this mismatch, Allied engineers and tankers pursued several parallel solutions, not all of which succeeded, and the failures matter as much to this story as the eventual answer. American designers experimented with heavier armor packages bolted onto standard Shermans, so-called jumbo assault tank variants, but these were produced in small numbers and could not be issued broadly enough to change the balance of most engagements. The doctrine of relying on separate tank destroyer battalions, equipped with lightly armored but hard-hitting vehicles like the M10 and later the M36, provided some relief, but these vehicles were themselves vulnerable and could not be everywhere infantry needed tank support. Attempts to simply out-produce the problem, building more 75mm Shermans faster than the Germans could build Tigers, addressed the strategic arithmetic of the war, but did nothing for the crew of any individual tank that found itself facing a Tiger at 700 meters with the wrong gun. American engineers also examined captured German vehicles and considered whether a wholesale redesign of the Sherman's turret and hull might close the gap, but any such redesign risked disrupting a production system that was, by 1944, delivering thousands of tanks a month across more than a dozen factories, an unacceptable trade-off when the invasion of France was already scheduled. Britain's own Challenger tank program, intended to mount the powerful 17-pounder gun on a purpose-built chassis, suffered repeated delays from mechanical problems with its running gear and was never produced in numbers sufficient to matter, a documented failure that pushed British ordnance officers toward a very different solution. None of these approaches on their own solved the fundamental technical problem. The standard Sherman gun could not reliably kill a Tiger from the front, and the standard Sherman armor could not reliably survive an 88mm hit from any range that mattered. The breakthrough that actually changed the equation came not from a wholesale redesign of the tank, but from a comparatively modest engineering solution developed in Britain. British ordnance officers had already fielded a highly effective anti-tank gun, the 17-pounder, mounted on towed carriages and on the Challenger tank program, but the Challenger itself proved troubled and was produced in limited numbers. 2 British officers, Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge and a Vickers engineer named W. G.K. Kilbourne, working with support from Major George Brighty, pursued a simpler idea: adapt the 17-pounder gun to fit inside the existing Sherman turret. This was not a straightforward swap. The 17-pounder was longer and generated significantly more recoil than the Sherman's original 75mm weapon, and engineers had to redesign the gun mounting, rotate the breech 90 degrees to fit the turret's interior space, and adjust the ammunition stowage to accommodate the larger shells. Resulting vehicle, designated the Sherman Firefly, retained the reliable Sherman hull, engine, and running gear that made the tank so easy to produce and maintain, while giving its crew a gun genuinely capable of killing a Tiger or Panther from the front at combat ranges. The 17-pounder, firing armor-piercing shot at velocities well over 2,900 feet per second, could penetrate the frontal armor of a Tiger at ranges the tank's own crews had previously considered safe. The engineering team also had to solve a series of smaller but critical problems. The turret's traverse mechanism needed rebalancing to handle the longer gun's shifted center of mass. A bulge had to be added to the turret's left side to accommodate the radio equipment displaced by the larger breech, and the crew compartment had to be reorganized so the loader could handle the 17-pounder's longer, heavier rounds efficiently under combat conditions. None of these changes required a new hull, a new engine, or a new production line, which meant Firefly conversions could be carried out relatively quickly on existing Sherman chassis shipped from American factories, preserving exactly the manufacturing advantage that had defined the tank's design philosophy from the start. Validation of this solution came quickly once Fireflies reached frontline units in the summer of 1944, though never in the numbers commanders wanted. British production converted roughly 1 in 4 Shermans issued to armored regiments into the Firefly configuration, meaning most troops of 4 tanks fielded only a single vehicle capable of reliably killing German heavy armor, with the remaining 3 still carrying the outgunned 75mm gun. German tank crews learned to identify the longer-barreled Firefly at a glance and prioritized it as the first target in any engagement, a grim testament to how effective the conversion had proven in practice. Despite this scarcity, the Firefly began to appear in after-action reports destroying Panthers and Tigers that earlier Sherman variants could never have touched, and its reputation among German tank commanders shifted within weeks from the dismissive contempt shown toward the standard Sherman to genuine wariness. The clearest and most thoroughly documented proof of what the Firefly, and by extension a properly employed Sherman crew, could do against Germany's most feared tank came less than 2 months after the disaster at Villers-Bocage, on August 8, 1944, during the opening phase of Operation Totalize south of Caen. A Sherman Firefly of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, commanded by Sergeant Gordon with Trooper Joe Ekins serving as gunner, was positioned near an orchard along the road between Caen and Falaise, close to the village of Sintho. Ekins, only 21 years old and new to combat, had not yet fired his tank's main gun in anger. That afternoon, a group of German Tiger tanks, part of the same heavy battalion that had devastated the British column at Villers-Bocage weeks earlier, advanced into view. Well camouflaged and holding fire until the range had closed to roughly 700 meters, Sergeant Gordon's crew waited for the order. When Captain Boardman gave the signal, Ekins fired on the rearmost Tiger in the group, striking it with 2 rounds from the 17-pounder gun and setting it ablaze. Because the Germans had not yet located the source of the fire, Gordon's crew was able to shift aim and engage a second Tiger, destroying it in the same brief engagement. A third Tiger, attempting to reverse and find cover after watching 2 of its companions burn, was struck by Ekins's gun and also destroyed. In the space of roughly 12 minutes, a single Sherman Firefly crew, using a gun adapted from a British anti-tank weapon and mounted in an American-designed hull, had killed 3 Tiger tanks that had advanced with every expectation of repeating the kind of one-sided victory Wittmann's company had achieved in June. Post-war research, drawing on both British unit records and German accounts compiled by historians studying the Schwer SS Panzerabteilung 101, concluded that the second of the 3 Tigers destroyed in that action was very likely the tank commanded by Michael Wittmann himself, the same Panzer ace whose single Tiger had devastated a British column at Villers-Bocage less than 2 months before. Wittmann and his entire crew were killed. Later that same day, as German forces mounted a counterattack, Ekins's Firefly engaged and destroyed a German Panzer IV medium tank before the Firefly itself was finally hit and the crew forced to abandon it. In total, 1 Sherman crew in a single day of fighting had destroyed 4 German tanks, 3 of them Tigers, including the machine that had come to symbolize German armored superiority in the eyes of Allied soldiers since the earliest days of the Normandy campaign. The significance of that engagement extended well beyond the personal drama of one crew's success. It offered proof, verified independently by both British regimental records and later German historical accounts, that the technical mismatch exposed at Villers Bocage could be overcome, not by replacing the Sherman wholesale, but by pairing its reliable, mass-producible chassis with a gun equal to the threat it faced. Armored commanders on both the British and American sides drew practical lessons from actions like this one throughout the late summer and autumn of 1944. American units, lacking access to the British 17-pounder, pursued their own parallel solution, upgunning many Shermans with a new, longer 76mm gun that offered improved, though still imperfect, performance against Panther and Tiger armor, and later introducing high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition that further closed the gap. Tactically, crews across both armies increasingly adopted the wide flanking maneuvers that tankers of the U.S. 2nd Armored Division had already begun using along the Rower Plain, deliberately drawing a Tiger's attention with one platoon, while a second platoon worked around to strike its thinner side and rear armor, a tactic that traded raw gun power for coordinated maneuver and cost many Allied crews their lives before it became standard practice. Scale and expansion followed quickly once these lessons were absorbed into doctrine and hardware. By the autumn of 1944, upgunned 76mm Shermans and British Fireflies were standard equipment in armored formations across the Western Front, no longer experimental oddities, but the backbone of the tank forces that pushed into the Low Countries and eventually into Germany itself. The Battle of Aracourt in September 1944, in which Sherman crews of the U.S. 4th Armored Division destroyed dozens of German Panther tanks in a series of engagements fought partly in heavy fog, demonstrated at a larger scale what Ekins' crew had shown in miniature, that trained crews, favorable tactics, and even marginally improved firepower could offset Germany's advantage in individual tank quality. Sherman-based vehicles also expanded into specialized roles during this period, including mine-clearing flail tanks, bridge layers, and amphibious, duplex drive variants that swam ashore during the Normandy landings themselves, a versatility that heavier and more mechanically complex German tanks could rarely match. At Aracourt, fought between September 18 and 29, 1944, in the Lorraine region of France, elements of the 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A found themselves engaging a numerically superior force of German Panther tanks belonging to the newly formed 5th Panzer Army, sent forward in a hurried counteroffensive against General George Patton's advancing 3rd Army. Thick morning fog on several of the battle's key days reduced visibility to a few hundred meters, effectively neutralizing the long-range advantage the Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun would normally have held over the Sherman's shorter-ranged weapons. American tank crews, using the terrain and closing distance rapidly under cover of the fog, destroyed a substantial number of German tanks over the following days for a comparatively modest loss of their own vehicles, a result that stunned German commanders who had expected their qualitatively superior Panthers to dominate the engagement. Contemporary American after-action reports and post-war historical analysis both treat Aracourt as one of the largest tank battles fought by American forces in the European theater, and it remains a frequently cited case study in how terrain, timing, and crew proficiency could offset a significant gap in individual vehicle performance. The wider historical impact of this technical and tactical struggle went well beyond the battlefield engagements themselves. Germany's emphasis on qualitatively superior but expensive and complex tanks like the Tiger, difficult to produce, maintain, and transport, meant that despite the tank's fearsome individual performance, Germany could field only a fraction of the armored vehicles the Allies eventually brought to bear. The Sherman's reliability and ease of repair, dismissed by some crews as small comfort when facing an 88mm gun, proved strategically decisive over the course of the campaign, keeping far more Allied tanks operational and available for combat on any given day than Germany's heavy tank force could match. Industrial capacity, not raw armor thickness or muzzle velocity, ultimately shaped the outcome of the tank war in Western Europe, and the Sherman, for all its documented vulnerabilities, was the vehicle that carried that industrial advantage onto the battlefield in overwhelming numbers. This dynamic had consequences that extended into the broader logistics of the war effort. Because the Sherman was designed from the outset for standardized mass production, its components, engines, transmissions, tracks, and ammunition could be manufactured across dozens of American factories and shipped abroad through an established supply chain that the U.S. Army had spent years building. German industry, by contrast, struggled to keep pace with Tiger and Panther production even before Allied strategic bombing began systematically targeting factories, rail lines, and fuel depots in 1944. A damaged Sherman could often be repaired within days by a divisional maintenance unit using parts drawn from a standardized supply system, while a damaged Tiger frequently required specialized parts and expertise that grew scarcer as the war ground on and Germany's industrial base contracted under sustained bombing. This gap in sustainment, as much as any single battlefield victory, explains why Allied armored divisions could absorb losses that would have crippled a less standardized force and continue advancing, while German panzer divisions, even when they won individual engagements, steadily lost the ability to replace what combat cost them. The Sherman's story did not end with the war in Europe. The tank remained in frontline American and Allied service through the Korean War, where updated variants with improved guns and armor continued to see combat against Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks. Beyond American and British forces, thousands of surplus Shermans were transferred or sold to armies around the world in the post-war decades. Israel's fledgling armored corps, in particular, built much of its early tank force around Sherman hulls, progressively rearming them with French-designed 75mm and later 105mm high-velocity guns in variants known as the M50 and M51, sometimes nicknamed the Super Sherman. These modified Shermans fought in the 1956, 1967 and 1973 Arab-Israeli wars, remaining in frontline or reserve service more than 3 decades after the tank was first designed, a testament to how far a sound, adaptable chassis could be pushed through incremental engineering improvements rather than wholesale replacement. The engineering lessons drawn from the Sherman's struggles against the Tiger and Panther also shaped tank design doctrine for decades afterward. Post-war American and British tank programs placed far greater emphasis on matching gun power to the armor of likely opponents from the outset, rather than relying on numerical superiority to compensate for a technical mismatch discovered only in combat. The practice of designing a tank around a chassis capable of accepting significantly upgunned variants over its service life, demonstrated so dramatically by the leap from the Sherman's original 75mm gun to the Firefly's 17-pounder and later Israeli 105mm conversions, became a standard consideration in later main battle tank programs from the American M60 to the British Centurion, both of which saw extended service lives precisely because their designers built in room for future upgrades in firepower and protection. The Sherman chassis itself continued to serve as a test bed and a workhorse for military engineers long after the guns of the Second World War fell silent. Beyond the Israeli M50 and M51 conversions, Sherman hulls were adapted into bridge-laying vehicles, armored recovery vehicles, and self-propelled artillery carriages used by armies in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East well into the 1960s and in some cases the 1970s. Military museums today preserve a number of these vehicles in running condition, including the Bovington Tank Museum in England, which maintains both a Sherman variant and the captured Tiger 131. A rare surviving vehicle originally built in Kassel in February 1943 and knocked out in Tunisia in April 1943, giving modern audiences a direct, physical comparison between the two machines whose rivalry defined so much of the armored war in Western Europe. Today, the Sherman tank occupies a complicated place in military history, remembered simultaneously as a vulnerable, undergunned machine that cost many Allied crews their lives, and as the vehicle whose sheer numbers and adaptability helped win the tank war in Western Europe. Both descriptions are accurate, and neither cancels out the other. The documented action of August 8, 1944, in which a single Sherman Firefly crew destroyed 3 Tiger tanks and a Panzer IV in one afternoon, killing the war's most celebrated Panzer ace in the process, stands as concrete proof that the Sherman's reputation as a hopeless death trap was never the whole story. It was a tank built for a different kind of war than the one it often found itself fighting, a compromise between mobility, production speed, and firepower that left individual crews outgunned in direct confrontations with Germany's heaviest armor. But paired with the right gun, the right tactics, and crews willing to close the range and take the shot, that same compromise machine proved capable of killing the tank the Germans believed could not be beaten. The problem the Sherman was built to solve, fielding an effective tank force fast enough and in large enough numbers to matter, remains a foundational lesson in military engineering, that a good enough machine, produced and adapted quickly, can outperform a superior one that arrives too late or too rarely to decide the battle. Nearly 80 years later, that lesson still shapes how modern armies think about balancing quality against quantity, and it is a lesson written not in abstract doctrine, but in the burned-out hulls left behind an orchard near Sintho on a single August afternoon in 1944. The German officers who dismissed the Sherman as a death trap were not wrong about its individual limitations against the Tiger's frontal armor and 88mm gun. Every documented loss on the Roer Plain, at Villers-Bocage, and across the hedgerows of Normandy confirms that judgment. But the same records that document those losses also preserve the account of Sergeant Gordon's crew and Trooper Joe Ekins, a shoe factory worker turned tank gunner who had never fired his weapon in combat before that afternoon, and who, in the space of 12 minutes, dismantled the very reputation his own tank had been built to fear. The Sherman was never the equal of the Tiger in a straight contest of armor against armor. It did not need to be. It needed only to be produced in enough numbers, adapted quickly enough, and crewed by men willing to close the distance and fire first, and on one afternoon south of Caen, it proved that was enough.